Goodfellas runs for nearly 2.5 hours. In that time, it covers roughly 20 years of organized crime life in New York. It shows the money, the dinners, the violence, the paranoia, and the federal noose tightening around a man who had built everything he had on sand. Critics called it one of the most accurate crime films ever made. Henry Hill himself said it was close to the truth. What nobody said, including Hill, was that it was the whole truth. Every hour of that film has a shadow behind it, a part of the life that the camera either sped past or declined to enter at all. The real Mafia was not just more violent than the film showed. It was more systematic, more sadistic, more willing to turn on its own people in ways the movie only hints at in passing. The debt collection, the internal discipline, the women used and discarded, the soldiers warehoused and forgotten, the junkies, the rats, the disappearances that were never solved, none of that made the final cut. This is what was left on the floor. Section 1. The tribute machine. Nobody filmed Henry Hill remembered the money the way a man remembers a good run of luck. There was always his more coming, always another score waiting, always a table full of cash getting divided in a restaurant back room. Goodfellas renders that memory faithfully. What it does not render is the economic engine underneath it, the system that moved money steadily upward through the hierarchy and left the men at the bottom working constantly just to stay level. The Lucchese family that Hill operated inside was structured in a strict vertical chain. At the top sat the boss. Below him, the underboss and the consigliere. Beneath those positions were the captains, called capos, each running a crew of made men and associates. Made men were sworn members, protected by the rules of the organization. Associates were everyone else. Men like Hill, useful and trusted, but without formal membership and without the protections that came with it. The film explains this clearly enough in broad strokes. What it does not explain is how that hierarchy functioned as a machine for pulling money upward, continuously, from the men at the bottom. Every earner in a Lucchese crew paid tribute to his captain on everything he made. A percentage of every robbery, every loan shark book, every gambling operation, every business that had been muscled went up the chain. The captain kept his portion and passed a share to the boss. The boss distributed pieces further. At the bottom of this arrangement, the man actually doing the work, absorbing the risk, and frequently absorbing the prison time, kept the smallest fraction of what passed through his hands. Henry Hill hands cash to Paul Vario in the film, with the warmth of a son bringing a gift to a father. The film keeps that warmth intact. What neither the book nor the movie examines directly is how punishing the tribute obligation became when times turned lean, when a crew had a bad stretch, when law enforcement pressure collapsed the gambling income or the hijacking opportunities dried up. A soldier who could not meet his weekly payment upward did not receive sympathy. He received pressure that escalated along a well-worn track. First came a meeting, then came the threat, then came physical persuasion. Associates fared worse because they lacked even the formal protection of membership to slow that process. The film hints at this dynamic when Tommy bullies Sonny Buns at the Bamboo Lounge, running up tabs and seizing control of the cash register. That scene reads as individual cruelty rather than institutional practice. In reality, it was both. The bleeding of useful civilians and low-level earners was standard operating procedure, and the organization enabled it because the organization benefited from it. Loan sharking was the economic center of a working crew in the period Goodfellas covers. The mechanics were straightforward. A borrower took money at 2 to 5 points per week, meaning 2 to 5% of the principal every 7 days, against a principal that never declined until it was paid completely. A man who borrowed $5,000 at 2 points owed $100 every week in interest alone indefinitely until he cleared the full balance. Most borrowers caught in genuine distress could not service both the interest and any meaningful portion of the principal simultaneously. The debt persisted. The payments continued. The lender collected for months or years on a single transaction. The film shows loan sharking as a side business and an occasional source of comic tension. What happens entirely off-screen is the daily work of collection against people who had nothing left to give. Compulsive gamblers who had borrowed against the next loss. Small business owners whose premises had already been stripped. Desperate people with no understanding of what they had agreed to. When those borrowers fell behind, the collection process was designed to produce maximum fear and maximum visibility. A collector arrived at the home and the workplace. The man's wife was approached. His employer was sometimes informed. His furniture, his car, the cash from his register, all of it was subject to seizure. The humiliation was deliberate because a humiliated man who could still produce anything was more valuable than a broken one who could produce nothing. The violence in collection was calibrated rather than impulsive. A dead debtor pays nothing. A debtor with serious permanent injury cannot work. The beatings that accompanied serious delinquency were aimed at maximum pain with minimum permanent damage, and the men best at delivering that outcome were employed specifically for it. Goodfellas does not show this work in any sustained form. The film's violence is explosive and operatic. The grinding, methodical cruelty of debt collection happens entirely in the margins. What the film builds and what is most misleading about the picture it paints is a sense of the Mafia as a brotherhood with a ruthless streak. The actual organization in this period was an extraction enterprise wearing the clothes of a criminal fraternity. The code and the rituals and the language of loyalty existed to serve the movement of money upward, and the men at the bottom, who believed in that code most sincerely, were the most useful to the men above them, because they would take more risk and absorb more punishment before breaking. The warmth was real in places. The structure underneath it was something else entirely. The tribute machine kept running on the suffering of ordinary earners and civilian borrowers, with nowhere to turn. What happened when the machine turned inward onto its own people was considerably darker than anything the film chose to show. Section 2. What happened to men? The organization was done. With the rules of the Mafia in the period, Goodfellas covers were not written down anywhere. No manual existed, no printed code, no formal disciplinary procedure. What existed instead was a system of expectations that every man inside the structure absorbed gradually, through observation and through the examples made of other men. The central expectation underneath all the others was simple. A man served the organization's interests, and when he stopped serving them, the organization was done with him, and being done with someone meant something specific and final. The film captures this in fragments. The Lufthansa robbery aftermath shows bodies turning up across the city as Jimmy Burke removes the people who could connect him to the money. The sequence is edited with a cold black humor, each death announced by a freeze frame and a title card, the rock and roll never stopping. What that editing strategy does brilliantly and somewhat dishonestly is aestheticize the disposal of human beings. The murders become a montage beat. The men dying were real people connected to a real robbery and real killings that federal investigators documented extensively over the following years. The film acknowledges their deaths while insulating the audience from their weight. What the montage skips entirely is the process by which men were identified as problems and the mechanism by which the decision to kill them was made. The Luces family and the other New York organizations in this period had no formal tribunal, no hearing, no process resembling anything considered or deliberate. A captain who believed one of his men had stolen from the family or was suspected of cooperating with law enforcement or had committed some offense against another family, raised the matter with the boss. The boss consulted with his consigliere, and sometimes with other captains whose interests were affected. A decision was reached, communicated in language that was never direct, and then carried out. The man identified as a problem was almost never informed. He was invited to a meeting, or a dinner, or a card game by someone he trusted, and he was killed by men he knew, often men he had considered close friends. The decision-making around these killings was not always accurate. Men were murdered on the basis of suspicion, rumor, and bad information. A soldier who had done nothing wrong but had an enemy with the ear of a captain could be removed before anyone with contrary information could intervene. There was no appeal. There was no mechanism for correction after the fact. The organization absorbed the error and moved forward. Sources covering this period in the New York families document multiple cases in which men were killed for suspected cooperation with law enforcement and were later determined, through subsequent investigations, to have been innocent of that suspicion. The killings had already occurred. Nothing followed from that determination. The film treats the threat of internal violence as something Henry navigates through luck and the protection of powerful patrons. The sustained reality of what it meant to operate inside an organization that could decide at any moment, on imperfect information and internal politics, that a man had become a liability, that reality is compressed into isolated dramatic moments rather than presented as the constant background pressure it actually was. There was also a category of men the organization did not kill, but simply warehoused. Soldiers and associates who had been useful once and had become marginal through age, poor health, or simple bad luck. These men were not promoted and not disposed of. They continued paying tribute on whatever small earnings they could still produce, taking whatever work their captain assigned, attending whatever meetings were required, living in a permanent middle state between usefulness and expendability. The film does not have room for these men because they generate no narrative momentum. They simply endure, paying their percentage upward, waiting for an end that comes either as a cell or a funeral. Men who were killed were also not always killed cleanly or quickly. A mob killing, carried out by professionals under controlled circumstances, was generally efficient. Killings carried out under time pressure, or by men without experience, or in circumstances that had not gone as planned, were sometimes prolonged and brutal. The record from homicide investigations in New York during the 1960s and 1970s documents deaths that bore no resemblance to the quick exits the film shows. Men were beaten extensively before being shot. Some were strangled. Some showed evidence of having been held for a period before being killed. The clinical ease with which the film dispatches its victims is a courtesy the real deaths were rarely afforded. Perhaps the most important thing the film omits about internal discipline is how widely the threat was understood, and how profoundly it shaped behavior of every man inside the structure. Henry Hill eventually became a government witness, partly because he understood that Jimmy Burke had already begun assessing him as a liability. That understanding was correct. Burke was, by most credible accounts, moving through the people connected to Lufthansa and eliminating them methodically. Hill made his move before Burke made his. The film renders this accurately, as a sequence of events. What it does not convey is that every man in a working crew lived with a version of that. Calculation running continuously in the background. Every conversation with a superior was read for signs. Every unexplained absence of a crew member was assessed. Every change in tone from a captain was examined for what it might mean. Men who lasted in that world for decades did so partly by learning to read those signs faster and more accurately than the men around them, and partly by luck, and partly by making themselves useful enough that the calculation always came out in their favor. The internal machinery of discipline is the darkest room in a structure the film presents with more warmth than the record supports. The love between men in those rooms was sometimes real. The threat underneath it was always real. The film chose the love. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The organizations disposed of its own men with the same cold logic it applied to outsiders, and the women attached to that world paid a price the film barely measured, which is where the next section goes. Section 3. The women the film romanticized Karen Hill gets more screen time than most mob wives in the history of the genre. Goodfellas treats her as a genuine perspective, not just furniture, and the film earns real credit for that. She narrates, she pushes back, she confronts Henry about his other women, stands in the street and screams at a neighbor who assaulted him, and walks through the paranoia of the later years with her eyes open. Lorraine Bracco's performance is precise and unsentimental in stretches. For all of that, the film still softens the reality of what women inside that world actually experienced, because the truth of it was not cinematic in any useful way. It was slow and corrosive and largely invisible, and it did not make for good freeze frames. The most fundamental thing the film skips is the economic position of the mob wife. Karen discovers early that Henry has money, that he moves through the world with a confidence that comes from never worrying about a bill. The film frames this as seduction, which it was. What it does not frame is the structural helplessnesses that came attached to that money. A woman married to a made man or a serious associate had no legitimate claim on any of the income flowing through her household. None of it was declared. None of it was banked in any traceable form during the years the crew was operating freely. The house might be in her name as an asset protection measure. But that was a legal maneuver for the husband's benefit, not a transfer of genuine control. When law enforcement arrived and began seizing assets, the wife discovered that the security she had believed she was living inside was a stage set. The money was gone before she could reach it, moved to places she had never been told about, held by people whose names she did not know. The film shows Karen flushing drugs down a toilet during a federal raid, and suggests that she knew enough about Henry's narcotics operation to be criminally exposed. That detail is accurate to the record. What the film does not develop is how systematically the men in these organizations used their wives and girlfriends as legal shields, and then left them exposed when the shields were no longer needed. Women were asked to hold cash, to sign documents, to receive stolen goods at the family address. When prosecution arrived, the question of what the wife knew and when she knew it became a tool prosecutors used to pressure the husband toward cooperation. The wife's legal jeopardy was not incidental. In many cases, it was manufactured deliberately by investigators who understood that a man who had shown no particular concern for his own freedom sometimes moved when his wife's freedom was threatened. Beyond the legal exposure, the daily texture of life for a woman in that world involved a particular kind of isolation that the film renders as glamour. The dinner scenes in Goodfellas are warm and crowded. The women at those tables are dressed well and eating well and appear to be part of something exclusive and exciting. What those scenes do not show is that the conversations at those tables were carefully partitioned. Men talked to men about the things that mattered, and women were present as decoration and as signals of a man's status. A wife who asked too many questions about where the money came from, or where her husband had been, was not indulged. The expectation of silence applied to women as thoroughly as it applied to soldiers, without any of the compensating status the code provided to men. The girlfriends occupied an even harder position. Henry's relationship with Janice Rossi runs through a section of the film as a source of domestic tension, almost comedic in the way it is handled. The reality of a girlfriend attached to a married wise guy was considerably grimmer. She had no standing within the organization, no protection from anyone senior to her boyfriend, and no recourse if the relationship ended badly. A girlfriend who knew too much and became a problem could be dealt with in any number of ways, none of them offered through a formal process. The film does not go near this. Janice Rossi disappears from the story when she is no longer useful to the plot, which is roughly the same way the real women in those positions disappeared from the lives of the men they had attached themselves to. The longer record of what happened to mob wives after their husbands went to prison or into witness protection is absent from Goodfellas almost entirely. Karen goes into the program with Henry, which is accurate. What the film does not examine is what witness protection actually meant for a woman who had built her entire adult identity inside a specific community, a specific set of relationships, a specific understanding of how the world worked. The program stripped all of that away and replaced it with a new name, a new city, and a government handler. Women who had spent decades inside those communities found themselves relocated to places where nobody knew them, with no transferable skills that could be declared on a job application, and with the permanent requirement of maintaining a cover story against the people closest to them. Several women in documented cases chose to leave the program rather than sustain that erasure, accepting the associated risks rather than continue living as someone they were not. The film's honest moment regarding the women comes in a scene most viewers treat as comedy. Karen stands in the street at night and lists for a neighbor exactly what will happen to him if he comes near Henry again, and the threat in her voice is completely real. That woman has absorbed the language and the logic of a world built on intimidation, and she is using it fluently. What the scene does not follow up on is what it costs a person to absorb that language, to make it natural, to have it available at 2 in the morning when a situation requires it. The film treats it as character color, the actual cost of becoming that person, of being shaped by years inside a structure that ran on fear, is the part that happens between the scenes and never quite makes it into the frame. The women in that world paid in isolation, legal exposure, and erased identity, at a cost the film rendered as atmosphere rather than damage. What the camera also avoided was the slow destruction the life worked on the men themselves, particularly the ones the drugs got hold of, which is where the next section goes. Section 4. The drug problem the film made look like a party Goodfellas does not hide the drugs. Henry Hill's cocaine use is central to the final act, and the film tracks his deterioration with enough honesty that the last hour carries a genuine anxiety the earlier sections deliberately withheld. The paranoid editing of the film's finale, the helicopter overhead, the sauce on the stove, the babysitter running late, is one of the most technically accomplished sequences Scorsese ever assembled. As a portrait of a man coming apart under stimulant psychosis, it works completely. As a portrait of what narcotics actually did to the organized crime world in New York during the 1970s and 1980s, it is radically incomplete, because Henry Hill's personal unraveling was not the story. The story was structural, and it was happening long before Hill picked up his first gram. The official position of the New York families on narcotics dealing in the post-war period was prohibition. The bosses had declared the drug trade-off limits, and the stated reason was pragmatic rather than moral. Drug convictions carried federal sentences of a length that created unbearable pressure on the men receiving them, and a man serving 25 years had very different calculations about cooperation than a man serving 3. The prohibition was genuine at the level of official policy. At the level of actual behavior, it was largely fictional, and the distance between the two was one of the more consequential lies the families told themselves during this period. Made men and associates throughout the New York families were dealing narcotics in significant volume by the late 1960s and through the 1970s. Some operated with the quiet tolerance of their captains, who took a percentage of the income while maintaining public distance from the activity. Some operated without their captain's knowledge, which was a dangerous position because discovery meant punishment, but the money was substantial enough that men accepted the risk. The Luchese family, which is the organization at the center of Goodfellas, had members and associates involved in heroin distribution networks that federal investigators documented extensively. Henry Hill's own narcotics operation was not a personal aberration from the culture around him. It was a relatively common feature of how working crews supplemented their income during a period when the traditional revenue streams were under sustained law enforcement pressure. What the film does not show is what widespread drug use did to the internal functioning of those crews over time. A soldier or associate who was using heavily became unreliable in ways that went beyond the personal. He missed meetings. He made decisions with impaired judgment. He talked when he should have been quiet, spent money that should have gone upward as tribute, and borrowed from loan shark books he had no capacity to repay. The paranoia that stimulant use produced in individuals produced a version of the same thing in small groups. Men who were using together began to suspect each other of informing, began to see surveillance where none existed, began to take actions based on fears that had no grounding in reality. Several documented cases from this period involve men killed on the basis of suspicions that originated in drug-induced paranoia rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The heroin trade specifically created a relationship between the families and street-level distribution networks that introduced new categories of risk the traditional structure was not designed to manage. Distributing at volume required working with people who were not part of the organization and could not be controlled through the usual mechanisms. Street dealers had no loyalty to a family, no investment in the code, and no particular reason to absorb a long sentence quietly when cooperation offered them a way out. The informant networks that federal investigators built during the 1970s and early 1980s ran substantially through the narcotics distribution chains, and the cases those networks produced were among the most damaging the families faced during the entire post-war period. Goodfellas treats Henry's drug use as a personal failing that accelerates his individual collapse. The film frames it as his weakness, rather than as a symptom of something happening across the entire structure around him. Jimmy Burke, in the film and in the record behind it, is shown disapproving of Hill's narcotics involvement, and that disapproval is presented as wisdom. The record is somewhat more complicated. Burke was, by various accounts, aware of, and in some cases involved in narcotics-adjacent activity himself, and his concern about Hill's drug dealing had as much to do with the exposure it created as with any principled objection to the trade itself. The film simplifies this into a clean moral contrast that the actual record does not fully support. The men who were consuming rather than distributing created a different category of problem. A crew with several heavy users among its earners was a crew whose income was being redirected from tribute payments into the pockets of their own suppliers. Captains who discovered that soldiers were using sometimes dealt with it through violence, sometimes through a period of enforced distance, and sometimes by simply writing the man off as a productive earner and reassigning his responsibilities to someone else. There was no treatment, no intervention in any recognizable sense. A man who had become a liability through his own consumption was managed the same way any other liability was managed, through pressure, reassignment, or removal. The film's finale remains one of cinema's great portrayals of individual disintegration, under drug use. What it cannot carry, because Hill's perspective was always personal rather than structural, is the damage the trade worked on the organizations themselves. The families that had built their stability on hierarchy, silence, and controlled violence found that narcotics introduced a solvent into all three. The money was too large to refuse and too corrosive to survive. And the families that most aggressively entered the trade during this period paid for it through the federal cases that dismantled their upper structures through the 1980s and into the 1990s. Henry Hill's story is one thread in that unraveling. The film treats it as the whole cloth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The drug trade ate through the families from the inside, while they publicly denied it existed, and the men who got caught in that machinery faced a choice between silence and survival that the next section examines in full, because the informant system was far larger and far older than Goodfellas ever acknowledged. Section 5. The informant system. Nobody wanted to see Henry Hill's decision to cooperate with federal authorities lands in Goodfellas as a dramatic climax, the moment when a man breaks the one rule his entire world was built on. The film frames it as a personal crisis forced by impossible circumstances, a man with no remaining options choosing survival over loyalty. That framing is accurate as far as it goes. What it obscures is that Hill was not an anomaly. He was not even particularly unusual. The informant system running through the New York families during the period the film covers was extensive, continuous, and in several cases predated Hill's cooperation by decades. The code of silence that the film treats as the organizing principle of that world was, in operational reality, honeycombed with exceptions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's formal program for developing organized crime informants had been running since the early 1960s. The effort that followed J. Edgar Hoover's long resistance to acknowledging the Mafia's existence produced, once it finally began, a systematic campaign to cultivate sources inside the families. Agents were assigned to specific crews and families, tasked with identifying men who might be vulnerable to an approach, and the approaches were methodical. A man with a recent arrest and a long exposure was a candidate. A man whose captain had recently humiliated him or passed him over was a candidate. A man with a sick family member and mounting medical bills was a candidate. The agents who ran these approaches were patient and they were skilled, and the record shows they were successful with a frequency that the family's public commitment to omerta entirely failed to reflect. Some of the most significant informants inside the Lushi family and the families adjacent to it had been providing information for years before Hill ever walked into a federal building. The intelligence that allowed prosecutors to build the cases that eventually dismantled the upper structures of several families came substantially from men who were still attending crew meetings, still collecting tribute, still sitting at the tables that Goodfellas renders with such warmth, while simultaneously reporting what they heard to a handler they met in a parking lot or a diner on the other side of the city. These men were not all operating out of fear or financial pressure. Some had developed genuine working relationships with their handlers over years. Some had concluded that the organization had treated them badly enough that the loyalty the code demanded was no longer owed. Some were simply practical men who had looked at the odds and made a calculation. The film's treatment of informing carries a moral weight that the actual record does not consistently support. Goodfellas presents the rats as men who broke faith with something real, and the code they violated is shown to have genuine content, genuine loyalty, genuine love between men. That content was real in places. The code was also used selectively and cynically by the men at the top of the structure, who invoked it when it protected their interests and discarded it when it did not. Bosses who cooperated quietly with law enforcement to remove rivals they could not eliminate through internal channels were documented in several families during this period. The use of law enforcement as an instrument of internal mob politics was not common, but sources confirm it occurred, and it gives the lie to any picture of the code as a consistent principle rather than a flexible tool. The men who informed and survived inside their crews for extended periods developed skills that the film never examines because Hill's cooperation came at the end of his criminal career rather than in the middle of it. A long-term informant inside a working crew had to manage two completely separate sets of relationships simultaneously, the one his crew believed he had with them, and the one he actually had with his federal handler. Every piece of information he passed had to be calibrated. Too much, and the specificity of what law enforcement knew would eventually point back to him. Too little, and his handler would lose patience and either expose him or withdraw protection at a critical moment. The men who threaded that needle successfully for years were operating under a psychological pressure that had no equivalent in the ordinary criminal life, and several documented cases show men who maintained that double existence for a decade or longer before either being discovered or choosing to come fully in from the cold. Discovery inside a crew was not always fatal, which is another thing the film's moral architecture does not accommodate. A man suspected of informing but not proven was sometimes watched rather than immediately killed, because killing an actual federal informant carried its own consequences, including the certainty of an intensive investigation and the possibility that the informant had left materials with his lid's hand designed to implicate specific individuals in the event of his death. Some suspected informants were simply frozen out, denied information, moved to the margins of crew activity, and allowed to continue existing in a reduced state. The organization's response to suspected cooperation was more varied and more pragmatic than the film's code of instant lethal retribution suggests. Hill's own cooperation produced results that the film only partially documents. The cases he contributed to extended well beyond the immediate circle of Jimmy Burke and the Lufthansa robbery. His testimony and the information he provided helped build prosecutions that reached into multiple crews and touched men he had known for his entire adult life. Some of those men went to prison on the basis of what Hill told the government. Some of them had been present at the dinners and the card games the film treats as the warmest scenes in its entire running time. The gap between those warm scenes and what Hill subsequently did with the information gathered in those rooms is the most honest thing the film could have shown and the thing it is least interested in examining. The informant system did not end with Hill's generation. The prosecutorial successes of the 1980s, built substantially on cooperating witnesses from inside the families, produced a generation of men who had watched their colleagues receive reduced sentences in exchange for testimony and who drew their own conclusions about the value of the code when the code's enforcers were themselves sitting in federal cells. The pipeline of cooperation that federal prosecutors developed during this period became self-reinforcing. Each cooperator produced cases that sent more men to prison, and each man sent to prison on the testimony of a former friend became a potential cooperator himself. The film shows one man's decision to inform. The structural reality behind that decision was a system that had been dissolving the code from the inside for 30 years before Hill ever made his call. The informant system had been running through the families for decades before Hill broke, fed by the same pressures and betrayals the film only showed from one man's angle. What those pressures produced in the men who refused to cooperate, who took the sentences instead, reveals a part of the life the camera never entered. which is where the next section goes. Section 6. The Prison Years Nobody Romanticized Goodfellas contains a prison sequence, and by the standards of the genre, it is almost aggressively pleasant. Paul Sorvino's Poli tends a garden. The men eat well, cooking meals that arrive through the fence from outside. There is wine. There is companionship. Henry observes that for Weisge's prison was just part of the life, a temporary inconvenience managed through money and connection, and the particular comfort of being surrounded by men who shared a common world. The sequence is brief, warmly lit, and functions primarily as a pause in the film's momentum, before the cocaine years accelerate the story toward its ending. As a portrait of federal incarceration for organized crime figures in the 1970s, it is, at best, a very selective truth, and at worst, a sustained piece of nostalgic fiction. The reality of federal imprisonment for men convicted of organized crime offenses during this period was shaped by several forces the film does not acknowledge. The first was sentence length. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970 and increasingly deployed against mob figures through the 1970s and 1980s, carried penalties that transformed the arithmetic of incarceration entirely. A man convicted under RICO faced the possibility of 20 years on a single count, with multiple counts running consecutively rather than concurrently. Men who had previously calculated their exposure in terms of a few years, manageable stretches that could be survived with the organization's support, and the promise of returning to a functioning crew, suddenly found themselves looking at sentences that consumed the remainder of their productive lives. The garden scene in Goodfellas involves men doing relatively short stretches, the men doing 15, 20, and 25-year sentences under RICO were not eating braciole in minimum security facilities. The conditions in the higher security federal facilities, where serious organized crime figures were housed during this period, were documented extensively by investigators, journalists, and the men themselves in subsequent court proceedings. Prolonged isolation was used as a management tool for men considered influential enough to continue running criminal operations from inside. A capo who could still communicate with his crew, pass orders through visitors and lawyers, and maintain his position in the hierarchy while incarcerated was a security problem for the institution, and the response was administrative segregation, restrictions on correspondence, limitations on visitor access, and in some cases, transfer to facilities far from the man's home city, deliberately severing the network of personal relationships through which he had exercised authority. The financial support that the film implies the organization provided to incarcerated members and their families was real in some cases and absent in others, and the distinction tracked closely with a man's position in the hierarchy at the time of his arrest. A high-ranking figure with strong personal relationships and a record of generating significant income for his superiors could expect his family to be looked after during his sentence. A low-level earner or associate who had been arrested on a case that implicated no one above him might find that the organization's concern for his welfare evaporated with considerable speed once it became clear he was going to take his sentence without creating problems. The families of men in that second category were frequently left without any meaningful support, and the wives and children of incarcerated associates navigated years of financial hardship, while the organization that had benefited from their husbands' and fathers' work provided nothing. The psychological deterioration that accompanied long sentences was another reality the film has no interest in. A man who entered federal custody at 35 and emerged at 55 returned to a world that had been reorganized entirely without him. The crew he had belonged to had been prosecuted, restructured, or simply aged out of relevance. The men he had trusted were dead, imprisoned, or had cooperated with the government. The contacts and relationships through which he had made his living were gone. His family had adapted to his absence in ways that sometimes made his return more disruptive than his departure had been. The skills he had spent his adult life developing, the specific knowledge of how to move through a criminal organization, how to read a room of dangerous men, how to generate income through illegal channels, had a diminished market in a landscape where the organizations themselves had contracted significantly. Some men emerged from long sentences and returned to criminal activity, partly from habit and partly from the absence of any other realistic option. Others attempted legitimate employment and found that a 20-year gap in a raison filled by a federal conviction was an obstacle most employers would not negotiate. The social services available to released federal prisoners during this period were minimal, and the specific population of released organized crime figures had little access even to what existed, because their known associations made them targets for supervised release conditions that restricted their movements, their communications, and the company they were permitted to keep. A man released on supervised release who was prohibited from associating with known felons was, in many cases, prohibited from associating with the majority of people he knew. The film's prison sequence functions as a grace note, a moment of unexpected comfort in a story that is otherwise accelerating toward disaster. That function is earned cinematically. What it costs the film is any honest accounting of what incarceration actually meant for the men who did serious time inside those federal facilities and for the families those men left behind. The organization that had asked those men to maintain their silence, to absorb their sentences without creating problems, had collected its benefit from that silence, and in many cases provided very little in return. The code that demanded loyalty flowing upward was considerably less reliable when it came to loyalty flowing back down, and the men warehoused in federal facilities during the decades. Goodfellas covers learned that lesson in conditions the film's garden scene was not designed to communicate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The men who took their sentences quietly discovered that the organization's promises ran in one direction, and the families left behind paid a cost that went entirely unfilmed. What the camera also avoided was the violence the real Mafia directed at civilians who had no connection to the life at all, which the next section addresses directly. Section 7. The Civilians Who Never Made the Screen Goodfellas is a film about men inside the life, looking outward at a world they preyed on, and the camera almost never reverses that angle. The civilians who appear in the film are mostly functional. They exist to be robbed, intimidated, borrowed from, or occasionally seduced. Sonny Buns loses his restaurant. The neighbor who assaults Karen gets pistol-whipped. The Air France cargo workers at the airport move through background scenes as props in someone else's story. None of them get a perspective. None of them get a name that lasts past the scene they appear in. The film is not interested in them, except as evidence of what the main characters are capable of. And that lack of interest reflects something true about how the men inside that world thought about the people outside it, while simultaneously reproducing the distortion rather than examining it. The businesses that organized crime crews systematically destroyed during this period represent the most thoroughly invisible casualty in the film's account. The bamboo lounge sequence, in which Tommy and the crew run up unpayable debts and then burn the place for insurance, is presented as a set piece illustrating how the life worked. What it does not present is the owner's subsequent reality. A man whose business has been stripped by a mob crew and then burned has no legal recourse available to him. filing an insurance claim on a fire that federal investigators suspect was arson invites scrutiny, the owner may not survive financially. Going to law enforcement to report the extortion that preceded the fire requires naming the men who did it, which requires a willingness to exist permanently inside the threat of violent retaliation. Most owners took neither path. They absorbed the loss and attempted to rebuild, often without the capital to do so, and the businesses that had served their neighborhoods for years simply ceased to exist. The neighborhood dimension of this destruction is another thing the film does not pursue. Organized crime crews in New York during the 1960s and 1970s operated in specific geographic territories, and the businesses inside those territories were subject to a permanent informal tax that the owners paid without any public acknowledgement that the tax existed. A restaurant owner in a Lucchese-controlled neighborhood paid for the privilege of operating without interference. A garment manufacturer paid for labor peace. A construction company paid for access to union contracts that would otherwise be withheld. These payments were not occasional. They were structural features of doing business in those areas, factored into operating costs, the way rent and utilities were factored in, and they transferred wealth steadily from legitimate business owners to criminal organizations for decades. The men who refused to pay, or who paid, and then attempted to report the arrangement to law enforcement, entered a category of risk the film never examines. A business owner who cooperated with federal investigators against an organized crime crew was not protected by anything resembling a functioning witness support system during most of this period. He could provide testimony, and in exchange he received the possibility of prosecution against the men he named, which might arrive years later after extensive legal proceedings, during which time he continued to live in the same neighborhood, operate the same business, and remain entirely visible to the men he had testified against and their associates. Several documented cases from this period involve witnesses in organized crime prosecutions who were killed, assaulted, or driven out of their businesses and homes before the cases they had contributed to ever reached a verdict. The longshoremen and airport workers who appear briefly in Goodfellas, but Goodfellas, as the human infrastructure of the hijacking operation, represent another category of civilian damage the film does not develop. Cargo theft at the airports and the docks was not a victimless crime in any economic sense. Insurance losses from systematic cargo theft during this period were substantial, and those losses were distributed through rate increases that affected every business and individual using those shipping channels. The workers themselves were caught in a coercive system that offered them a choice between participating in the theft and absorbing whatever consequences non-participation brought. A dock worker who refused to look the other way when a truck was being loaded with stolen cargo was a dock worker whose union position, whose livelihood, and in some cases whose physical safety became subject to pressure from men who had been managing that particular pier for years. The violence that organized crime directed at purely civilian targets, people with no connection to the life and no capacity to protect themselves through any available mechanism, appears in the film only in the form of Henry's attack on the neighbor who assaulted Karen. That scene is shot and edited to make the violence feel righteous, a husband defending his wife, the brutality proportionate to the offense that provoked it. What the film cannot acknowledge without dismantling its own moral framework is that the same men shown committing that satisfying act of protection were also directing violence at people who had done nothing more offensive than falling behind on a loan, or refusing to sell a business, or being present at the wrong moment in a dispute that had nothing to do with them. The selectivity of the film's violence, shown when it generates sympathy, and withheld when it would generate revulsion, is one of the central mechanisms through which the film produces its affection for men whose actual conduct the record does not support. Bystanders were killed during this period in circumstances the families regarded as unfortunate but acceptable. A man executed in a public location left witnesses. Witnesses were sometimes managed through intimidation and sometimes through violence. A person who had seen something they were not meant to see and who showed any sign of being willing to discuss it with law enforcement moved into a category where their continued existence became a subject of organizational calculation. The film does not show the people who fell into that category because their stories have no connection to Henry Hill's perspective, and because their presence would require the film to account for damage it prefers to aestheticize or ignore. What the civilian record shows, assembled from court documents, investigative journalism, and the testimony of prosecutors who worked these cases across multiple decades, is an ecosystem of harm that extended far beyond the men inside the life and their immediate families. The neighborhoods these organizations controlled paid in suppressed legitimate business in the absence of competition that extortion and violence prevented from entering, in the diversion of union funds from workers to criminal hierarchies, and in the steady background fear that shaped daily life in ways that were never dramatic enough to film, but were experienced as a permanent condition by the people who lived inside them. Goodfellas chose its perspective, and its perspective was always Henry's. Henry never looked back at what his world cost the people who never chose to be part of it. The civilians paid continuously and invisibly, and their losses never appeared on screen because the film never turned its camera around. The final thing Goodfellas left on the floor was the ending, not Henry's ending, but the ending that came for the organization itself, which was considerably less glamorous than anything the film suggested. Section 8. How the real Mafia actually fell apart. The final frames of Goodfellas show Henry Hill standing outside a suburban house in a bathrobe, complaining that his new life as an anonymous civilian is a punishment, that the food is bad, and the people are ordinary, and the whole arrangement is beneath him. The film ends on that note of bitter comedy. Henry diminished and resentful, the glamour gone. What comes after that frame, in the actual history of the organizations the film is built on, is not a story about one man's reduced circumstances. The dismantling of the New York families through the late 1980s and into the 1990s was a structural collapse of an organization that had operated continuously for decades, and the mechanisms that produced it were already in motion through every scene in the film, invisible because the film was not looking for them. The legal instrument that changed everything was the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Passed by Congress in 1970, RICO was designed specifically to address the problem that had frustrated organized crime prosecution for the previous 2 decades, the difficulty of convicting the men who directed criminal activity, rather than the men who physically carried it out. Previous prosecution strategies had required connecting specific individuals to specific criminal acts, which the organizational structure of the families was specifically designed to prevent. A boss who gave an order verbally to an underboss, who communicated it through a captain, who passed it to a soldier, was 4 steps removed from whatever physical act resulted, and each step was a gap that reasonable doubt could occupy. RICO changed the evidentiary framework entirely. A prosecutor no longer needed to prove that a specific defendant had committed a specific crime. The statute required proving that the defendant had participated in a pattern of racketeering activity through an enterprise, and the enterprise itself, the family as an organization, became the subject of prosecution. The first major RICO cases against the New York families produced results that the organizations had no strategic response to because the strategy they had relied on, silence, and organizational insulation was precisely what the statute was designed to circumvent. The Confessions case, prosecuted in the mid-1980s by a federal strike force in New York, used RICO to put the bosses of 4 of the 5 New York families on trial simultaneously, charging them not with specific criminal acts, but with participating in the commission that the families used to manage disputes and coordinate activity. The convictions produced sentences that effectively ended the active leadership of those organizations. Paul Castellano, the Gambino boss, was killed before the case reached him. Anthony Salerno of the Genovese family received a 100-year sentence. Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family, the man who had succeeded Paul Vario's generation of leadership, received a 100-year sentence. Fat Tony Salerno died in prison. Tony Dux Corallo died in prison. The generation of bosses that the film's characters served their entire careers under was removed from the street permanently, not through violence, but through a federal statute they had no mechanism for defeating. The information that built those cases came substantially from the surveillance and cooperation networks that had been developing through the previous decade. A listening device placed inside the car used by Anthony Corallo produced recordings of Corallo discussing organizational business with his driver and his consigliere over an extended period. The recordings were damaging, not because they documented specific crimes in prosecutable detail, but because they established the existence and operation of the organizations itself, which was what RICO required. Corallo spoke freely in what he believed was a private space, and what he said in that space was used to anchor a prosecution that ended his freedom permanently. The operational security failures that allowed that surveillance to succeed reflected a broader pattern across the families, a generation of leaders who had operated for decades without significant legal consequence, and who had developed a confidence in their own insulation that the changed legal landscape did not support. The cooperation that followed the first wave of major RICO convictions accelerated the process in ways that compounded geometrically. A man facing a 100-year sentence under RICO had a different relationship to the code of silence than a man facing 5 years on a theft charge. The mathematics of cooperation became compelling to men who would not previously have considered it, and the prosecutors who had built the RICO framework were skilled at presenting those mathematics clearly. Each cooperator produced testimony and documentation that opened new cases, and each new case produced its own population of defendants facing their own sentencing calculations. The pipeline did not empty. Subsequent years saw it widen as the prosecutorial infrastructure built during the commission case was applied to crews and captains across all 5 families. The Lucchese family, which is the organization at the center of Goodfellas, experienced its own specific version of this collapse through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. The leadership that succeeded the generation the film depicts was itself prosecuted and convicted under RICO in cases that drew substantially on cooperating witnesses from inside the organization. The family that had operated continuously and profitably since the post-war period contracted to a fraction of its former size and influence over the course of roughly a decade, losing its upper structure to federal prosecution and its earning capacity to the disruption that sustained law enforcement pressure produced. What the film cannot show, because it ends before any of this occurs, is that the world Henry Hill walked away from in 1980 was already entering its terminal phase. The organizations he had given his adult life to were not permanent institutions temporarily inconvenienced by law enforcement pressure. First, they were structures whose operating model depended on conditions that were in the process of being systematically dismantled by a combination of legal innovation, sustained prosecutorial attention, and the cooperation of enough insiders to make organizational silence functionally impossible. The glamour of the early sections of Goodfellas, the money and the dinners and the power, was the surface of something that was already dying. And the film's nostalgia for that surface is the one thing it cannot examine honestly, because honest examination would require acknowledging that what is being mourned never deserved mourning in the first place. The end came not through a dramatic confrontation, but through paperwork, through recorded conversations, through men sitting across tables from prosecutors and calculating what their silence was worth, to an organization that had already demonstrated what its members were worth to it. The real dark side of the world Goodfellas built its film around was not the violence, which the film showed abundantly. It was the mundane and comprehensive failure of everything the violence was supposed to protect, which the film never stayed around long enough to witness. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The organizations the film romanticized fell apart through a combination of legal innovation and mass cooperation, undone by the same silence they had demanded from everyone beneath them. What remains is to gather everything the film left out and hold it against what it chose to show, which is where the final section lands. Section 9. The mythology the film built and what it cost Goodfellas did not invent the romanticization of organized crime. The genre had been doing that work for decades before Scorsese put Henry Hill in front of a camera and let him narrate his own legend. What Goodfellas did was refine the mythology to a point where it became almost impossible to argue with because the film was so technically accomplished, so precise in its surface details, and so genuinely pleasurable to watch that the distortions embedded in its structure arrived wrapped in what felt like documentary honesty. The central distortion is the one that runs through every section of this script. The film presents the Mafia as a world with real costs and real violence, while simultaneously generating sustained affection for the men who ran it and the life they built. That combination is not accidental. Scorsese and Hill and Pileggi assembled the story from Hill's memories, and Hill's memories were the memories of a man who loved that life even after it destroyed him, who described federal witness protection as a punishment worse than prison, who spent his remaining years giving interviews and selling his story and doing everything in his power to remain connected to the identity the life had given him. The film inherits that love and reproduces it for 2.5 hours, and the result is a portrait whose emotional truth belongs entirely to one participant's perspective, while presenting itself as something larger. The audiences who absorbed that mythology carried it forward in ways that had measurable consequences. Several documented cases from the years following the film's release involve men who cited Goodfellas specifically as formative, who had watched it repeatedly and modeled their understanding of organized crime on what it showed. Prosecutors and law enforcement figures working organized crime cases in the 1990s noted in various public statements that recruits to criminal organizations in that period arrived with expectations shaped substantially by the film, expecting a world of loyalty and excitement, and clearly defined codes that the actual organizations they entered bore little resemblance to. The mythology was not harmless entertainment. It was operational, and it shaped the behavior of real people in real situations. The men the film is most generous to were, in the documentary record, among the most consistently destructive figures their communities produced. Jimmy Burke, rendered by De Niro with a cold charisma that generates something close to admiration, was by the evidence a man who killed people he had known for decades with apparent ease, whenever their continued existence became inconvenient. The warmth the film grants him in his early scenes is earned cinematically and contradicted historically. The code the film treats as real was, for Burke and for the men above him, a tool applied selectively and discarded freely. The film knows this and shows it, and still asks the audience to feel the loss of that world when it ends. That ask is the mythology's final cost. Goodfellas closes with Henry resentful and diminished, and the film frames his diminishment as something worth mourning. The neighborhoods his organization systematically extracted wealth from for decades are not in that frame. The civilian borrowers whose lives the Lone Tin Shark operations consumed are not in that frame. The families of men warehoused in federal prisons are not in that frame. The women who lost their names and their histories to witness protection, or who stayed and absorbed the consequences, are not in that frame. The film ends where Henry's sympathy ends, and it asks the audience to end there too. The mythology Goodfellas built was precise enough to feel like truth and selective enough to function as fiction, and the gap between those two things is the dark side the film was never willing to fully enter. Section 10. The verdict, everything examined across these sections, points toward the same conclusion, which is that Goodfellas is simultaneously one of the most technically honest crime films ever made and one of the most emotionally dishonest. Those two things coexist because the film operates on two separate registers that almost never intersect. At the level of surface detail, the film is rigorous. The clothes are right. The hierarchy is right. The specific texture of how those men talked and ate and moved through rooms is rendered with an accuracy that the real figures who appear in the background of the production reportedly confirmed. At the level of consequence, the film is a sustained act of selective vision, showing what its narrator loved and declining to fully account for what that love cost everyone, outside the narrator's field of sympathy. The tribute system that extracted continuous wealth from the men at the bottom of the hierarchy and from every civilian business the organization could reach does not appear in the film as a system. The internal discipline machinery that killed men on the basis of rumor and organizational politics is aestheticized into montage. The women attached to that world are rendered as perspectives, rather than examined as people whose lives were structured by coercion they had limited capacity to escape. The drug trade is personalized into one man's failing rather than examined as a structural solvent that ate through the families from the inside. The informant system that honeycombed the code of silence for decades before Hill broke is absent entirely. The prison years that consumed the lives of men who took their sentences quietly are shown as a garden. The civilians who paid continuously and without recourse are props. The legal mechanisms that actually dismantled the organizations are off-screen because they happen after Henry's story ends. What remains when all of that is accounted for is a picture of an organization that was, in operational reality, a machine for producing harm at scale, sustained by violence and silence, and the continuous extraction of wealth from people who had no means of resistance. The film knows this in fragments and acknowledges it in moments and then returns, reliably, to the warmth of the table and the pleasure of the money and the seductive rhythm of men who moved through the world, as though the rules that governed everyone else had been suspended specifically for them. The dark side Goodfellas never showed was not a collection of scenes that got cut for time. It was the structural consequence of choosing one's man's affectionate memory as the governing perspective of a story whose full account would have required a camera willing to turn around and face what was standing behind Henry Hill the entire time. That camera was never part of the production. The film that exists is the one Hill could have loved, which is precisely why it feels the way it does, and precisely why the record behind it tells a different and considerably heavier story. Henry Hill died in 2012, still talking about the life, still giving interviews, still performing the identity the Mafia had given him decades after the Mafia itself had ceased to exist in any form he would have recognized. He had outlived most of the men he had known. Paulie Vario died in federal custody in 1988. Jimmy Burke died in a New York state prison in 1996, serving time for a murder conviction unrelated to Lufthansa. The Lukshis family that had been the center of Hill's world had been prosecuted into a shadow of its former structure by the time Hill reached old age. The organization he had loved and betrayed and mourned for the rest of his life was, by any measurable standard, gone. What persisted was the film. Goodfellas kept running, on cable and on streaming platforms and in repertory cinemas, accumulating new audiences who received the mythology fresh with each viewing. Every generation that came to it encountered the same warmth and the same violence and the same invitation to feel the glamour before the consequences arrived. And most of them accepted the invitation the way audiences have always accepted it, because the film is genuinely extraordinary at what it does. And what it does is make a world built on systematic harm feel, for 2.5 hours, like somewhere a person might have wanted to be. The honest accounting of that world is not a refutation of the film's craft. Scorsese made something real and lasting. The accounting is simply the other side of the ledger, the one the film kept off screen, the one populated by the people who never got a freeze frame or a title card or a rock and roll soundtrack accompanying their particular moment of loss. They existed. The record confirms they existed. The film chose not to follow them home, and that choice is the clearest statement the film ever made about whose story it believed it was telling, and whose it did not. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.